When your own children won't return your calls, you start to wonder if you matter at all. Martin Cole sat alone in his apartment at 59, divorced and abandoned, questioning where everything went wrong. A letter arrived about an inherited house from a distant uncle. The place was tucked into the Montana mountains, built right into the cliffside. Martin had nowhere else to go, so he drove north through the snow. He expected a cold, empty house. Instead, the lights worked and the floors were warm. On the kitchen table sat a journal with his name written inside. What had his uncle left for him to find? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The drive from Billings had taken Martin Cole nearly 4 hours, and for most of that journey he'd questioned his sanity. The highway gave way to state routes, then county roads, and finally to something that barely qualified as a road at all, more a suggestion carved through pine forest and stone. His truck handled it well enough, but his nerves frayed with every mile that took him further from civilization. Snow had started falling around noon, fat flakes that gathered on his windshield faster than the wipers could clear them. The world outside narrowed to what his headlights could illuminate. Tree trunks dark as charcoal, the occasional flash of a reflective marker, and endless white descending from a sky he could no longer see. Martin had left his apartment in Billings 3 years ago, after the divorce papers were finalized. That small one-bedroom place with its beige carpet and humming refrigerator had been his entire world since Claire moved out. She'd taken the house, their house, the one where they'd raised Andrew and Catherine. She deserved it, really. She was the one who'd made it a home. He'd just paid the mortgage and showed up for dinner. The apartment had been adequate. A place to sleep, to grade papers when he still had students to teach, to eat microwaved meals while watching shows he never really followed. After the school district offered early retirement, encouraged it, more accurately, citing declining enrollment and budget constraints, even that small routine had evaporated. He'd been 56 then, too young to stop working but too tired to start over. His children had their own lives by then. Andrew worked in Seattle doing something with computers that Martin had never fully understood, despite multiple explanations. Catherine taught elementary school in Portland, following somewhat in her father's footsteps, though she'd never quite said so. They'd sided with their mother during the divorce. Not openly, not with declarations or heated arguments, but with silence. Calls that went to voicemail, text messages that earned one-word replies, invitations declined with vague excuses about schedules and obligations. By the time the letter arrived from Feldman and Associates, attorneys at law, Martin had gone 8 months without hearing his daughter's voice, and nearly a year since Andrew had answered his calls. The letter had been formal, almost cold in its precision. It informed him that his uncle, Elliot Cole, had passed away at the age of 93. Martin had to think hard to even remember the man, a tall figure at a funeral when Martin was 7, then again at a family reunion when he was 12. Uncle Elliot had seemed ancient even then, with silver hair and hands that moved with careful deliberation. He'd asked Martin questions about school, about what he liked to read, and had actually listened to the answers. That was the memory that stuck, being listened to. The inheritance was unexpected. A house, the letter said, located in the Montana wilderness, approximately 70 miles northwest of Billings. The property included the house itself, 12 acres of land, and all contents therein. There were no conditions, no requirements beyond signing some papers and paying minimal transfer fees. Martin had almost declined. What did he need with a house in the middle of nowhere? But then he'd looked around his apartment at the walls he'd stared at for 3 years, at the silence that had become his only companion, and thought, why not? So here he was, grinding up a mountain in a snowstorm, following GPS coordinates and increasingly dubious road signs, looking for a house he'd never seen left to him by a man he barely remembered. The coordinates led him to a turnoff marked only by a cairn of stacked stones. The road, if it could be called that, cut through dense forest for another mile before opening into a clearing. And there it was. Martin stopped the truck and stared. The house seemed to grow from the cliff face itself. Behind it, a wall of basalt columns rose like a frozen pipe organ, hexagonal pillars of dark stone reaching 50 feet into the grey sky. The house had been built directly into this formation, its back wall formed by the ancient volcanic rock. The front was all glass and weathered wood, modern lines softened by the snow gathering on its angular roof. It shouldn't have looked welcoming, it should have looked cold, forbidding, like something from a fairy tale meant to warn children away. But warm light glowed in the windows. Smoke rose from a chimney he could barely make out against the darkening sky. Someone had been here. Recently. Martin's heart quickened as he pulled closer. Had the lawyers arranged for caretakers? The letter hadn't mentioned anyone. He parked near what appeared to be the front entrance and sat for a moment, engine idling, trying to decide if he should be concerned or relieved. The door was unlocked. He pushed it open slowly, half expecting to interrupt something, but the house greeted him with silence and warmth. The entrance opened into a wide room with polished concrete floors and exposed beam ceilings. A wood stove radiated heat from the far wall. The furniture was simple but well made, a sofa covered in wool blankets, two leather chairs that looked broken in but not broken down, shelves lined with books. "Hello," Martin called out. His voice sounded strange after hours of silence in the truck. No answer. He moved through the space carefully, taking inventory. The kitchen occupied one end of the great room, separated by a long counter of butcher block wood. The appliances were old, but clean. The pantry, when he opened it, was stocked canned goods, dried pasta, rice, flour, coffee. More than just staples, someone had prepared for a guest. Off the main room, a hallway led to 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. The larger bedroom held a bed made up with fresh linens. The smaller had been converted to an office or study, with a desk facing a window that looked out onto the forest. But it was what he found on the kitchen table that stopped him completely. A leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth by decades of handling. Resting on top of it, a note written in careful script on cream-colored paper, asterisk, "For Martin when you're ready. Welcome home. E.C. Asterisk." Martin picked up the note with shaking hands. The paper felt expensive, substantial. The handwriting belonged to someone who'd learned penmanship in an era when such things mattered. He opened the journal to the first page. Asterisk. January 1952. I have decided to keep a record, not of events, which are tedious and will be forgotten, but of intentions. Why we build matters more than what we build. This journal will be a record of why. Asterisk. The entry continued for several pages, describing Eliot's early work as an architect, his frustrations with contemporary design, his belief that buildings should serve not just practical needs, but emotional ones. The writing was clear, thoughtful, occasionally passionate. Martin sank into one of the kitchen chairs, the journal open before him. Outside, full darkness had fallen. Snow continued to pile against the windows. He was alone in a house he'd never seen, reading the thoughts of a man he'd barely known, and for the first time in 3 years, he didn't feel the crushing weight of his solitude. He felt something else, something he couldn't quite name yet. Curiosity, perhaps, or the faint, fragile beginning of hope. Martin woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows. For a disorienting moment, he couldn't remember where he was. Then memory returned. The drive, the house, the journal. He'd fallen asleep in the bedroom fully clothed, too exhausted to do more than kick off his boots. The morning was crystalline and cold. Through the bedroom window, he could see the forest blanketed in fresh snow, each branch weighted with white. The sky above was that particular shade of blue that only seemed to exist in mountain winters, sharp and clean and impossibly bright. He found coffee in the pantry and worked out the old percolator on the stove. While it burbled and hissed, he explored the house more thoroughly in daylight. The main room revealed details he'd missed in last night's dim lamplight. The exposed beams weren't just structural, they'd been carved with subtle patterns, geometric designs that caught the eye without demanding attention. The wood stove sat on a raised hearth of smooth river stones. Every window framed a specific view: forest, cliff face, sky. The house felt intentional. Nothing was arbitrary or accidental. After his second cup of coffee, Martin ventured into the basement. Wooden stairs descended into what he'd expected to be a dark, damp space. Instead, he found a workshop bathed in natural light from ground-level windows. A long workbench ran along one wall, its surface scarred but organized. Tools hung on pegboards with the precision of someone who knew exactly where everything belonged. But it was the drawings that drew him across the room. Architectural blueprints covered an entire wall, pinned and overlapping, some yellowed with age, others fresher. Martin recognized the house above him in various iterations: early sketches, detailed elevations, cross-sections, showing the integration with the basalt cliff. But there were other drawings too, theoretical structures, buildings that existed only on paper, designs labeled with notations about acoustic resonance and emotional geometry. One blueprint showed a circular room with walls that curved, according to mathematical formulas Martin didn't recognize. Annotations in Eliot's handwriting read, "Asterisk amplifies contemplation, dampens anxiety. Test occupant response after 30-minute intervals." Asterisk. Martin stepped back, unsettled. His uncle hadn't just been an architect, he'd been conducting experiments. That's when he noticed the radio. It sat on a shelf near the window, a vintage tube radio, the kind his own father had owned in the early 1972s. A Hallicrafters S-38, if Martin remembered correctly. The metal casing had been polished recently. Someone had cared for this object. He reached out to touch it and jerked his hand back. The metal was warm, not hot, but noticeably warmer than room temperature. He checked there was no heater vent nearby, no direct sunlight hitting the shelf. The radio sat in relative shadow, yet it radiated gentle heat like something recently used. Martin clicked it on, half expecting nothing. Tube radios took time to warm up, if they worked at all after decades of storage. Sound came immediately. Static at first, the white noise hiss of dead frequencies. Then, emerging from that emptiness, fragments of a voice. Male, older, the words too distorted to make out clearly. Martin adjusted the dial carefully, trying to find the signal. The voice clarified for a moment. "Martin, if you're hearing this," his heart hammered. He froze, afraid to move and lose the frequency. "Exactly where you need to be." The house, static, swallowed the words. "Machine for living, but also for remembering. Don't be afraid of more static, what you've forgotten." Then silence. Just empty hiss across the bandwidth. Martin's hands shook as he checked the radio's dial. The frequency it was tuned to didn't make sense. It was outside the normal AM broadcast range, somewhere in the spectrum that shouldn't carry voice signals at all. He pulled out his phone, Googled the model number and frequency specifications. According to every source he could find, the radio couldn't receive broadcasts on that frequency. It was technically impossible. Yet he'd heard it, heard his name, heard what sounded unmistakably like his uncle's voice, though he had no clear memory of how Eliot had sounded. Martin sat down on the workshop stool, phone still in his hand. The screen showed a voicemail notification he'd missed during his exploration. He almost deleted it, without listening. Most calls these days were spam or debt collectors, but something made him check the number. Andrew. His son's voicemail was brief. "Dad, got your message about the inheritance. Call me back. We need to discuss next steps." No greeting. No inquiry about how Martin was doing or whether he'd made the drive safely. Just business. Martin's thumb hovered over the callback button, then moved to the delete icon instead. Not yet. He wasn't ready to have that conversation, the one where Andrew would ask about property values and sale timelines and what Martin planned to do with his share, though legally the house belonged solely to Martin. He pocketed the phone and returned his attention to the radio. It sat silent now, just an old piece of technology on a shelf. But that warmth remained, subtle but undeniable. Martin spent the afternoon reading more of the journal. Elliot's entries from the 1,950 seconds described his apprenticeship under Frank Lloyd Wright at Taliesin West. The legendary architect had been in his 80s then, still working, still teaching, still insisting that buildings should grow organically from their sites rather than being imposed upon them. Wright says, "A house should be of the hill, not on the hill." Elliot had written. But I think he doesn't go far enough. A house should be of the people who live in it. It should shape them as much as they shape it. Architecture isn't just about space, it's about time, about memory, about what remains when the inhabitants are gone. As Martin read, daylight faded into dusk. He'd lost track of time completely, something that hadn't happened in years. At the school, every hour had been measured by bells. In his apartment, every evening had been measured by the programs he watched and didn't really see. Here, time moved differently, slower, or perhaps just less noticeable. He made dinner from what he found in the pantry pasta, with canned tomatoes and herbs that still had some life in them, despite being dried. The kitchen was well equipped, the stove responsive, everything functional. As he ate, he watched snow begin, falling again beyond the windows. That night, he dreamed vividly. He was 7 years old again, standing in his grandmother's backyard during that reunion. Uncle Elliot knelt beside him, showing him something in the grass, a spider's web strung between two fence posts, each strand catching sunlight. "Look how it's built," Elliot said. "Every thread has a purpose. Nothing is wasted." That's good design. The dream shifted. He was older now, maybe 15, in his father's house. His father sat in his recliner, newspaper raised like a wall. Martin tried to speak, to say something important, but no words came out. His father never lowered the paper. Then he was standing in the house he'd shared with Claire, watching her pack boxes. Catherine stood in the doorway, not the adult she'd become, but the 8-year-old she'd been, holding a stuffed rabbit. "Where are you going, Daddy?" she asked. But he wasn't the one leaving. He was the one being left. Martin woke with tears on his face. The room was dark, except for moonlight filtering through the curtains. He lay still, letting the dream fade, but the emotions remained grief and loss, and something deeper, something he'd been avoiding for 3 years, regret. Not just for the divorce, though that was part of it. Regret for all the moments he'd been present, but not truly there. All the conversations he'd half listened to while thinking about tomorrow's lesson plans. All the school events he'd attended but rushed away from. All the times he'd chosen solitude over engagement because it was easier, safer, less demanding. He rose and walked to the kitchen, seeking water. The journal still sat on the table where he'd left it. Beside it, he noticed something that made him stop mid-step. The journal was open to a different page than where he'd stopped reading. He'd closed it before bed. He was certain. Yet here it was, open to an entry dated 1968. Margaret died today. They tell me I'll heal. That time will ease this wound. But I don't want it to ease. I want to remember exactly how this feels, because this pain is proof of what we had. This is the price of love, and I would pay it again and again. I will build something that lasts. Something that holds time instead of letting it slip away. A space that remembers. Martin's hands trembled as he picked up the journal. The page felt no different than any other. There was no rational explanation for how it had opened on its own. Unless he'd done it himself and forgotten. Unless he was more tired than he'd realized. Or, unless the house was doing exactly what Elliot had designed it to do, Martin spent the next 3 days systematically reading through Elliot's journal. He rationed the entries, reading only a few pages each morning with his coffee, letting the words settle before moving forward. It felt important not to rush, though he couldn't have explained why. The journal revealed a man of remarkable depth and peculiar obsessions. After Margaret's death in 1968, Elliot had thrown himself into research that straddled the line between architecture and psychology. He'd studied how ceiling heights affected mood, how natural light influenced circadian rhythms, how acoustic properties could amplify or dampen emotional states. Visited the Rothko Chapel in Houston. One entry from 1971 read, Rothko understood something most architects miss, that space itself can be an emotional experience. The paintings are just the excuse, it's the room that does the work. The proportions, the light, the way sound dies against those walls. You walk in, agitated, and walk out contemplative. That's not the art. That's the architecture. Martin found this fascinating in a way nothing had fascinated him for years. He'd taught history for 3 decades, always focusing on events and dates and the movements of armies and governments. He'd never considered that the buildings themselves might be just as important, that the spaces people inhabited shaped not just their activities, but their inner lives. He discovered a section of blueprints that showed the house above him in cross-section, with notations that read like musical compositions. Eastern room, morning light, high ceiling, hard surfaces. Purpose, clarity, awakening, decisive thought. Another, western room, afternoon light, lower ceiling, soft surfaces. Purpose, creativity, dreaming, possibility. Martin decided to test this. He spent an entire morning in the eastern room, what he'd been using as the living room, working through some legal documents the estate lawyer had sent. He found his mind unusually sharp, able to focus on the tedious language without his attention drifting. The light came in at an angle that felt energizing rather than harsh. That afternoon, he moved to the western room, the smaller space with the desk. He'd brought a notebook, thinking he might write down some thoughts about what to do with the property. Instead, he found himself sketching something he hadn't done since college. Just simple drawings, nothing artistic, but the act itself felt natural in that space. The light was softer here, almost golden. The ceiling pressed down just enough to feel intimate rather than confining. Elliot had been right. The rooms did influence him. The question was whether that influence was real or just the power of suggestion. Over those first days, Martin also explored the property. The snow had tapered off, leaving everything crystalline and still. Behind the house, a trail led up through the basalt formations to a higher elevation. The climb took 20 minutes, his breath coming hard in the thin air, but the view from the top was worth it. The entire valley spread below him, miles of forest punctuated by rocky outcrops, a frozen stream threading through the bottom, and far in the distance, the faint geometry of roads and civilization. From up here, his apartment in Billings seemed impossibly far away, not just in distance, but in essence. That life, the beige carpet, the humming refrigerator, the neighbors he'd never spoken to belonged to someone else. At the highest point of the trail, he found a viewing platform made of weather-treated wood. Someone had carved initials into one of the posts, EC plus ML 1961. Elliot and Margaret. 7 years before she died. Martin stood there for a long time, gloved hands resting on the railing his uncle had once touched, looking out at a view his uncle and aunt had once shared. The wind moved through the pines with a sound like distant ocean waves. A raven called from somewhere below. Otherwise, silence. That evening, he returned to the journal and found entries from the period just after Margaret's death. The handwriting became less controlled, the thoughts more raw. I failed her. Not in the ways that matter to divorce courts. I was faithful, present, attentive. But I failed her by not building something that could hold us both after she was gone. All our life together exists now only in my memory, and when I die, it dies too. That's intolerable. There must be a way to preserve not just images and objects, but the feeling of a life lived together. Asterisk. A few entries later, asterisk, began sketching the cliffside house today. It will be my masterwork. Not my most beautiful building, I'm past caring about beauty for its own sake, but it will be the most intentional. Every line, every angle, every material choice will serve a purpose. I will build a house that remembers. Asterisk. Martin closed the journal and sat in the gathering dark. The wood stove ticked and creaked as it cooled. Outside, the temperature was dropping fast. He could hear the trees contracting in the cold, small pops and cracks like distant fireworks. His phone buzzed. A text from Andrew. Asterisk. Dad, you're ignoring my calls. We need to talk about the property. Call me. Asterisk. Martin stared at the message. The word property bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Not the house or Uncle Elliot's place. Property. A thing with monetary value. Nothing more. He typed back, asterisk, I'm here. It's not what I expected. Need more time to figure things out. Asterisk. Andrew's response came immediately. Asterisk. Time costs money. Property taxes, utilities, maintenance. We should list it before spring. Mountain properties sell better in summer. Asterisk. We. As if this were a shared decision. As if the inheritance had been left to both of them. Martin deleted the message thread without responding further. He'd deal with Andrew later, or not at all. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he didn't feel obligated to justify his choices to his children. The next morning brought another discovery. While exploring a closet in the smaller bedroom, Martin found a box of old photographs. Most showed Elliot and Margaret wedding photos from 1960 vacation snapshots, pictures of the two of them at various construction sites with blueprints spread across makeshift tables. But beneath these were older photographs, family gatherings from the 1942nd and 52nd. Martin recognized his grandmother in several, much younger than he'd ever known her. There were children in these photos, Martin's father among them, sullen even as a boy, standing apart from the group. And there, in the background of a photo from what looked like a 4th of July picnic, stood a young Elliot, watching the children with an expression Martin couldn't quite read. Not sadness, exactly. More like concern. Like someone who saw something others missed, Martin found a letter tucked between the photographs. The envelope was addressed to Elliot in his grandmother's handwriting, postmarked 1985. Inside, the letter was brief. Asterisk. Elliot, I'm writing because I don't know who else to tell. I'm worried about Martin. He's 12 now, a good boy, smart and kind. But Charles is so hard on him. Nothing the boy does is good enough. I see Martin closing off, becoming like his father, distant, afraid to show warmth. If something happens to me, promise you'll look after him. Not with money, but with attention. He needs someone who sees him. Your sister Dorothy. Asterisk. Martin read the letter 3 times. His grandmother had died when he was 14. He'd forgotten, or maybe never fully realized, how much she'd worried about him, how clearly she'd seen what was happening. And Elliot had received this letter, had kept it all these years, had remembered. That afternoon, Martin walked back up to the viewing platform. The initials carved in the post caught the slanting light differently now that he knew their story. E. C. plus M. L. A promise made in 1961, 7 years before it would be broken by death. But not really broken, Martin thought, because Elliot had kept building, kept creating, kept trying to hold on to what they'd had. This house was proof that love didn't end just because life did. He stood there, until the cold drove him back down, his mind turning over questions he couldn't quite articulate. Questions about what we leave behind, what we build, what we choose to remember. That night, the radio activated on its own. Martin was in the kitchen making tea when he heard it, the hiss of static from the basement workshop. He descended the stairs slowly, uncertain what he'd find. The radio glowed warm amber, its dial illuminated. The voice that emerged from the speaker was clearer than before. "The house will show you what you've forgotten. Let it." Then silence. Martin stood in the workshop doorway, steam rising from his mug, and wondered if he was losing his mind or finding it. The bookshelf in the western room had always bothered Martin, though he couldn't say why. It was a beautiful piece, floor to ceiling, dark walnut with careful joinery, but something about it felt wrong. Too deep, maybe. Or positioned oddly, jutting into the room more than necessary. On his 8th day at the house, while dusting a domestic activity he'd taken up with surprising enthusiasm, he leaned against it for balance and felt it shift. Not collapse, shift, like something on a track. Martin stepped back and examined the shelf more carefully. The books were mostly architectural texts, biographies of Wright and Le Corbusier, technical manuals on passive solar design. He began removing them, stacking them on the floor. With the shelves empty, he could see what he'd missed, small brass hinges along one edge, barely visible in the wood grain, and on the opposite side, a subtle gap. He pushed. The entire bookshelf swung inward on those hidden hinges, revealing a small octagonal room beyond. Martin stood at the threshold, heart pounding. The room was perhaps 10 feet across, with walls lined in more bookshelves and filing cabinets. A skylight above provided natural illumination. He must have seen it from outside, without registering what it meant. In the center sat a comfortable reading chair, upholstered in worn leather, a small table beside it with a reading lamp. This was Eliot's private library, his real archive. Martin stepped inside, and the bookshelf swung silently closed behind him. For a moment, panic fluttered in his chest. What if he was trapped? But he saw immediately that the interior side had a simple handle. He could leave whenever he wanted. The room smelled of paper and leather and time. Martin turned slowly, taking inventory. The filing cabinets were labeled by year. 1950 to 1960, 1000, 961 to 1000, 970, and so on through 2023. The bookshelves held, not published volumes, but bound journals, dozens of them, uniform in size, each spine marked with dates. These were Eliot's complete records, everything. Martin pulled a journal at random from the 1972 and opened it. Detailed entries about the construction of the cliffside house, sketches of the basalt integration, notes on subcontractors and material suppliers, but also personal reflections, grief management, philosophical questions about architecture and memory and permanence. He replaced it and selected another from the 1980. This one focused on other projects, a library in Bozeman, a private residence near Glacier National Park, but interspersed were observations about family, about watching nieces and nephews grow up from a distance, about sending birthday cards and receiving polite thank you notes in return. And there, in an entry from 1985, shortly after receiving his grandmother's letter, asterisk, Dorothy's right to worry. I saw Martin at the reunion last summer. 11 years old and already learning to hide himself, Charles treats the boy like a project that's failing to meet specifications. I tried to talk with Martin, but he barely responds. Already building walls. I recognize the architecture, it's how I survived my own father. But surviving isn't the same as thriving. I should do something. But what? I'm a 70-year-old bachelor. What do I know about raising children? Asterisk. Martin sat down in the leather chair, the journal open in his lap. His uncle had been watching him, worrying about him, seeing things that Martin himself hadn't recognized for decades. He spent the rest of the day in that hidden room, reading through Elliot's life in fragments. The years accumulated: Margaret's death, the aftermath, the slow reconstruction of a life lived alone but not empty. Elliot had continued designing buildings, teaching occasionally at Montana State, corresponding with other architects and engineers. But the most revealing documents were in the filing cabinets. Martin found folders stuffed with letters, correspondence with family members spanning 50 years. Letters to and from Martin's grandmother until her death in 1987. Letters to cousins, to Martin's father, even a few to Martin's mother before she died when he was 16. One folder was labeled simply, Martin. Inside were copies of letters Elliot had sent over the years. Birthday cards Martin vaguely remembered receiving. A letter when Martin graduated high school, full of encouragement and advice he hadn't appreciated at the time. Another when he'd gotten his teaching position, congratulating him on choosing a profession that mattered. Martin had responded to maybe half of these. Brief thank you notes, nothing substantial. He'd thought of Elliot as a distant relative who sent cards out of obligation. He'd never realized the attention, the care, the genuine interest. And there, at the bottom of the folder, were letters Elliot had written but never sent. Drafts, dated from the past 5 years. One, dated 2020. Asterisk. Dear Martin, I heard about your divorce. Dorothy would have wanted me to reach out. I know what it's like to lose the person who made sense of your world. The difference is, your children are still alive. Don't let them become strangers. Don't do what I did. Don't choose pride and isolation over uncomfortable conversations. You still have time. Asterisk. The letter had been revised several times, words crossed out and rewritten, entire paragraphs deleted, but it had never been sent. Another from 2022. Asterisk Martin. I'm 92 years old. The doctor says I have a year, maybe 2. I've decided to leave you the house, not because you need property, but because I think the house needs you. Or maybe you need it. I built it to be a place of healing, though I never fully healed myself. Perhaps you'll do better. I hope this doesn't feel like a burden. Think of it as a question the house asks, and you get to decide the answer. Asterisk. This letter had a note at the bottom in different ink, dated 3 months later. Asterisk. Decided not to send. Better to let the house speak for itself. Asterisk. Martin set the letter down carefully. His hands were shaking. All these years, he'd thought himself forgotten, abandoned, of no interest to anyone. But Elliot had been watching, had been thinking about him, had been, in his own careful way, loving him from a distance. He found one more document in that folder, a letter addressed to him, sealed in an envelope marked, Open when you understand. Martin held it for a long time, feeling its weight. Not yet. Whatever was inside would change something, and he wasn't ready. He returned it to the folder and closed the cabinet. The hidden library also contained photographs Martin had never seen. Elliot and Margaret on their wedding day, both of them radiant. Margaret in the kitchen of some earlier house, laughing at something beyond the frame. Elliot at construction sites, examining blueprints, always with that look of intense concentration. And family photos. The same ones Martin had found in the closet, but also others. Pictures of Martin himself at that reunion, when he was 11, standing awkwardly in a polo shirt his mother had insisted on. At his grandmother's funeral, barely 14, looking lost. A newspaper clipping from when Martin had been named Teacher of the Year at his high school, 2003. Elliot had kept it. Someone knocked. No, something knocked. A branch against the skylight, moved by wind. Martin looked up and realized how dark it had become. He'd been in the library for hours. He emerged into the main house feeling disoriented, like a diver surfacing too quickly. The western room seemed different now, knowing what it concealed. Everything in this house had layers, secrets, intentions. Martin made dinner mechanically, pasta again, with vegetables from the freezer. As he ate, he thought about the letters Elliot had written and not sent. the watching from a distance, the care expressed through architecture rather than words. His phone sat on the counter, dark and silent. He could call Catherine, could try one more time to bridge the gap, but what would he say? That his dead uncle had cared about him more than his living children did. That he'd found a hidden room full of proof that someone had been paying attention when everyone else had been looking away. Instead, he cleaned his dishes and returned to the hidden library. He pulled the most recent journal, 2023, the year Elliot died, and began to read. The entries were shorter now, the handwriting less steady, but the mind behind them remained sharp. Asterisk the 3rd of January 2023. Doctor confirmed what I already knew. Months, not years. I'm content with this. I've built what I meant to build, loved who I meant to love. The house is ready. Martin will come when he's ready. I wish I could be there to see it, but perhaps it's better this way. The house will teach him things I never could. Asterisk, the 15th of January 2023. Wrote to Martin's children, both of them. Asked if they'd consider reconciliation, offered the house as neutral ground, a place for the family to heal. I made sure they understood this wasn't about inheritance. Martin gets the house regardless. This was about relationship. Asterisk, Martin's breath caught. Elliot had reached out to Andrew and Catherine. He flipped forward, looking for what came next. Asterisk, the 2nd of February 2023. Received responses from both. Andrew's was curt, essentially told me to mind my own business. Catherine's was kinder but equally clear. Their relationship with their father is over. They've moved on. As if people were just chapters you could close. I tried. I failed. Perhaps Martin will have better luck. Or perhaps he'll learn something I never did, that you can't fix what others are determined to keep broken. Asterisk, Martin closed the journal. His uncle had tried, had reached out, advocated, attempted to build bridges. And his children had refused. The rejection wasn't his alone. It belonged to both of them, to Martin and to Elliot, the uncle who'd tried to help. In that moment, something shifted. The pain didn't disappear, but it became something he could hold differently. He wasn't uniquely broken. He was part of a pattern, a family story about distance and silence and missed connections. But unlike his father, unlike the generations before, he'd felt the pain of it. That had to count for something. Martin found the recipe box on a shelf in the kitchen pantry, tucked behind mason jars of preserved peaches. It was a simple wooden box, hand-painted with faded flowers, the kind of domestic object that spoke of a different era. Inside were index cards covered in careful cursive, each recipe written in the same flowing hand. Margaret's handwriting. The first card he pulled was for apple cake. Below the ingredients and instructions, a note read, Asterisk, Elliot's favorite. Always use extra cinnamon, he says. It reminds him of his mother's kitchen. Serve warm on difficult days. Asterisk, another card. For beef stew, asterisk. Let it simmer low for 3 hours minimum. Good food takes time. So does good conversation. Make this when you need both. Asterisk. And another for bread. Asterisk. Kneading is half the point. Your hands need the work as much as the dough does. When your mind is restless, make bread. Asterisk. Martin stood in the kitchen, the box in his hands, and felt something break open in his chest. These weren't just recipes. They were Margaret's philosophy, her understanding that cooking was care made tangible, that food could communicate what words sometimes couldn't. He selected the bread recipe and began. It had been years since he'd baked anything from scratch. Claire had been the cook in their marriage, creative, intuitive, able to improvise meals from whatever was in the refrigerator. Martin had been the consumer, offering compliments but never really participating. After the divorce, he'd lived on takeout and frozen meals, eating alone while staring at his phone. Now he measured flour, dissolved yeast, mixed and kneaded. The dough was sticky at first, resisting his efforts, But gradually it came together. His hands worked the mass, folding and pressing, and he understood what Margaret had meant. The repetitive motion was meditative. His mind, which had been churning with thoughts about Elliot's letters and his children's rejection, began to settle. While the dough rose, he made coffee and sat at the kitchen table. The morning light came in at the angle Elliot had designed for clear, energizing. Martin found himself thinking about Catherine, his daughter, 8 months since they'd last spoken. Not because of any particular fight, but because of accumulated distance, the slow drift that neither of them had tried to stop. She'd been close to her mother during the divorce. Martin understood that. Claire had been present in ways he never managed. Claire had remembered parent-teacher conferences and soccer schedules and which friends were having problems. Martin had been there technically, but always slightly distracted, always thinking about tomorrow's lessons or department politics or his own quiet dissatisfactions. He pulled out his phone before he could talk himself out of it and typed, "Catherine, I'm thinking about you. I hope you're well. No need to respond. Just wanted you to know. Asterisk." He stared at the message for a full minute before hitting send. The bread baked while he read more of Margaret's recipe cards. Each one contained small revelations, glimpses into a marriage built on attention and care. Elliot gets quiet when he's worried. Make his favorite soup the potato one. Don't ask what's wrong. Just be there. And his birthday chocolate cake. Always. He pretends not to care about celebrations, but he does. Everyone does. When the bread came out of the oven, the house filled with a smell that belonged to home in some essential way. Martin sliced it while it was still warm against all baking advice and ate a piece with butter. It was imperfect, denser than it should have been, but it tasted like accomplishment. His phone buzzed. "Catherine, Hi, Dad. I'm okay. Thanks for checking in. Not much. Not warm, but not hostile either." Martin stared at those 3 sentences, reading them over and over, trying to extract more meaning than they probably contained. He typed back, "I'm glad. I'm in Montana, inherited a house from Uncle Elliot, learning to bake bread, of all things, The response took longer this time. Bread is good. Grounding. I bake when I'm stressed. Helps. Something loosened in Martin's chest. They were having a conversation, brief, careful but real. I'm learning that. He wrote. There's something about working with your hands. I spent too many years just in my head. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Yeah, I remember. You were always somewhere else, even when you were home. The words stung because they were true. Martin sat with that sting, let it hurt, rather than defending himself. You're right. I was. I'm sorry for that. No response came. Martin waited 5 minutes, then 10, then set the phone aside. Maybe that was all Catherine could manage today. Maybe it was enough. That afternoon, he returned to Elliot's journals, now reading the volumes from the 1990 seconds. Elliot had continued building smaller projects, mostly consultations for other architects, some teaching. But the entries also reflected on fatherhood, on family, on regret. Met with George Haskins today about his community center project. He brought his daughter along, maybe 7 or 8 years old. She sat in the corner drawing while we talked, and every so often he'd go over to see what she was working on, just checking in, showing interest. It made me think about all the children I never had. Margaret and I tried for years. It wasn't meant to be. Now I wonder if I could have been good at it, or if I would have been like my father, present but cold, providing but not nurturing. Perhaps it's better this way. You can't fail at something you never attempted. Asterisk, Martin closed the journal. Elliot's regrets and his own were different in specifics but similar in shape. Both of them wondering if they'd gotten the important things right. Both of them suspecting they hadn't. He spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the property again, walking the perimeter of the 12 acres. The boundary was marked with occasional cairns, stones stacked in careful piles. He found deer tracks in the snow, the delicate prints of what might have been a fox, the geometric patterns of bird feet. The isolation here was complete, but not oppressive. In his apartment in Billings, he'd been alone and lonely. Here, he was alone, and somehow less lonely. The distinction mattered in ways he was just beginning to understand. That evening, he made Margaret's potato soup, the one for when Elliot got quiet and worried. He followed the recipe exactly, letting the potatoes simmer until they were soft enough to mash slightly, adding cream and butter and fresh ground pepper. The result was simple, but deeply satisfying. As he ate, his phone buzzed again. Catherine, asterisk, I'm getting married. In 6 months. I wasn't going to tell you, but Mum said I should. Asterisk. Martin's hand tightened on the spoon. He set it down carefully. Asterisk. Congratulations. That's wonderful news. What's his name? Asterisk. Asterisk Greg. He's a teacher too. 4th grade. Asterisk. Asterisk. He's lucky to have you. Asterisk. A longer pause this time, then asterisk. I haven't decided yet if I'm inviting you. I need to think about it. I don't want drama at my wedding. Asterisk. Martin took a breath, typed. Asterisk. I understand. Whatever you decide, I'm happy for you. You deserve every good thing. Asterisk. No response came, but he hadn't expected one. He finished his soup, washed his dishes, and sat by the wood stove as darkness fell outside. Catherine was getting married. To another teacher, someone who might understand her in ways Martin never had. The thought brought both joy and sorrow, joy that she'd found someone, sorrow that he might not be there to see it. But that was Catherine's choice to make. He'd hurt her through years of absence while present, and she had every right to protect her wedding day from complications she didn't want to manage. The hardest thing, Martin realized, was accepting that apologies didn't always lead to reconciliation, that understanding your mistakes didn't erase their consequences, that his children's lives would go on, with or without him, and that might have to be enough. The radio in the basement activated around 9 o'clock. Martin had almost been expecting it. He descended the stairs and stood in the workshop doorway, listening. The voice was clearer than ever. You're doing better than you know. Keep going. Just that. Then silence. Martin smiled despite himself. I'm talking to a radio, he said aloud, or a house, or my own imagination. This is either healing or madness. No response, of course. Just the gentle hum of the tube radio warming the air around it. He climbed back upstairs and went to bed, but sleep took a long time to come. He lay in the dark thinking about bread and recipes and small acts of care, about Catherine's engagement and whether he'd be there to see her married, about Elliot, who'd built this house as an act of love for a woman who died and a family that barely knew him. Outside, wind moved through the pines with a sound like breathing. The house settled and creaked around him, and for the first time in years, Martin felt like he was exactly where he needed to be, even if he didn't yet understand why. The library's octagonal clock had bothered Martin since he'd first discovered the hidden room. It took him 3 days to figure out why. It ran backwards. The hands moved counterclockwise, tracing time in reverse. At first, he'd thought it was broken, but the movement was too precise, too steady. Someone had built it intentionally to run this way. He found the explanation in one of Elliot's journals from 1995, tucked between entries about a library renovation in Helena. Asterisk. Finished the clock today. Took me 3 weeks to modify the mechanism. Margaret would have laughed at this, my attempt to build a machine that reclaims lost time. Of course, it doesn't actually move us backward, but it honors what was. Every tick is a reminder that the past isn't truly past. It lives in us, shapes us, defines what we build next. If I can't go back, I can at least acknowledge what mattered. The clock doesn't change time. It changes how we think about it. Asterisk. Martin sat in the leather chair, watching the second hand sweep the wrong direction around the dial. It should have felt disorienting, but instead it felt honest. Time didn't just move forward, it accumulated. Everything that had happened was still happening, in a way still shaping who he was, still influencing what he chose. He'd been at the house for 7 weeks now. February had given way to March. The snow had begun its slow retreat, revealing brown grass and patches of mud. The spring thaw was coming, bringing with it decisions he couldn't postpone forever. Andrew called that afternoon, while Martin was splitting firewood behind the house. Physical labor had become his meditation, his body learning tasks his mind had never considered. The rhythmic swing of the maul, the satisfying crack of wood yielding, the organization of split logs into neat rows. He answered on the 4th. Ring, slightly out of breath. "Hello." "Finally," Andrew said. "No greeting. I've been calling for 2 weeks. I know." I needed time to think. "About what?" "It's simple. The property's worth at least 400,000, probably more. We list it, split the proceeds, move on with our lives." Martin set down the maul and sat on the chopping block. "We don't split anything. The house was left to me. I'm your son. You are, but that doesn't give you ownership of my inheritance." Silence on the other end, sharp with surprise. Martin had never contradicted Andrew directly before, had always tried to smooth conflicts, accommodate, avoid confrontation. "Are you serious right now?" Andrew's voice had gone cold. "After everything this family has been through, you're going to be selfish about money?" "This isn't about money. It's about what the house means. The house means $400,000. That's what houses mean, their market value." Martin watched a crow land on a nearby branch, its black feathers gleaming in the pale sunlight. "I'm not selling." "Then what are you doing with it? Living there like some hermit?" "You're almost 60 years old, Dad. You can't just disappear into the mountains." "I'm not disappearing. I'm figuring out what comes next. What comes next is you get practical and sell while the market's good." Andrew's voice had an edge. Martin recognized the tone of someone who'd made up his mind and couldn't imagine being wrong. Martin's own voice, he realized with discomfort. The voice he'd used with his students when he was tired of explaining. "I'm keeping the house," Martin said quietly. "My decision is made. Then you're on your own. Don't expect help from me when you can't afford the upkeep." "I don't expect anything from you, Andrew. I haven't for a long time." The line went dead. Andrew had hung up. Martin set the phone on the chopping block and looked at his hands. Calloused now, rough from work, they didn't look like a teacher's hands anymore. They looked like hands that built things, maintained things, created rather than just consumed. That night, the radio spoke again without prompting. Martin had been reading in the library when the familiar hiss of static drifted up from the basement. He descended the stairs to find the radio glowing its warm amber. The voice that emerged was thoughtful, almost conversational. "The house knows what you need to hear. It's not magic, it's design. I built resonance into the walls, acoustic properties that amplify certain frequencies. The radio plays recordings I made before I died, triggered by changes in air pressure, temperature, humidity. Your presence in the house activates them. They're not random, they're responses. Or maybe they just feel like responses because you need them to be. Does the difference matter?" Martin stood in the doorway, transfixed. This was the longest broadcast he'd heard, and for the first time it acknowledged itself as a recording, as technology rather than something supernatural. "I've been thinking about what we leave behind," the voice continued. "Objects, certainly. Money, property. But those things are just things. What matters is pattern, behavior. The habits of thought we pass down without meaning to. My father was cold. I was cold. You've been cold, Martin, though you don't want to be. The question is whether the pattern continues or whether someone finally breaks it. Static swallowed the words. Martin waited, but nothing more came. He returned to the library and pulled down another volume from the 1970 seconds. Inside, he found correspondence with a physicist named Harold Berkshire at Stanford. The letters discussed acoustic theory, resonant frequencies, and something called architectural memory. Asterisk, what if spaces could hold information? Asterisk, Eliot had written. Asterisk, not like recording devices, but like tuning forks that vibrate in response to specific frequencies. A room designed with the right proportions could amplify certain emotional states, play them back, in a sense. Not perfectly, but recognizably. I've been experimenting with the library. Margaret loved that room. She spent hours there. I wonder if I can build something that remembers her presence, that echoes it for whoever comes after. Asterisk. The physicist's response was skeptical but intrigued. Asterisk. You're describing something between architecture and instrument design. Possible in theory, but the variables would be incredibly difficult to control. Every person who entered would change the acoustic properties. Still, as a metaphor for how spaces shape experience, it's fascinating. Asterisk, asterisk. It's not a metaphor. Asterisk, Eliot had written back. Asterisk. It's engineering. I'm going to build it. Asterisk. Martin set down the letters and looked around the octagonal library. The proportions were unusual, not quite circular, not quite square. The ceiling curved in a way that felt natural but wasn't standard. The books themselves would absorb and reflect sound in specific ways. Had Eliot actually succeeded? Had he built a room that remembered? Or was Martin just experiencing what anyone would experience, a carefully designed space that influenced mood and thought? Maybe, as the radio suggested, the difference didn't matter. He spent the next 2 days in deep introspection, writing in the blank journal Eliot had left. Not letters to anyone else, but letters to himself. Examining his marriage, his fatherhood, the slow accumulation of small choices that had led to isolation. One passage he wrote, and then reread several times. Asterisk. I was there for every birthday, every graduation, every major event. But I was armored, protected. I showed up, but didn't participate. Didn't risk being vulnerable, being seen, being wrong. I thought that was strength. I thought that was being a good father, providing stability, being consistent, not burdening my children with my own emotions. What I actually did was teach them that feelings should be hidden, that connection is dangerous, that love is something you demonstrate through presence but never through actual intimacy. I gave them a roof, but not a home, just like Dad gave me. Asterisk. The recognition settled into him like a weight and a relief simultaneously. He couldn't change what he'd done, but he could stop pretending it hadn't mattered. That evening, he wrote 2 letters, real ones, on paper he found in Eliot's desk, one to Andrew, one to Catherine. To Andrew, he wrote an apology without defensiveness, an acknowledgement of his failures as a father, a release from any obligation to maintain relationship. Asterisk, I understand if you're done with me. You have that right. I'm sorry for the ways I failed you. I hope your life is good. You don't owe me forgiveness. Asterisk. To Catherine, he wrote similarly but added a paragraph about her wedding. Asterisk. Whatever you decide about inviting me, I'm proud of you. You deserve joy. You deserve a partner who sees you, who's present with you in ways I never learned to be. I hope Greg is that person. I hope you build something together that's better than what I built with your mother. You don't need my blessing, but you have it anyway. Asterisk. He drove 40 minutes to the nearest town the next morning and mailed both letters. The drive back felt lighter somehow, as if he'd set down something he'd been carrying without realizing its weight. The house waited for him in its clearing among the pines, light glowing in the windows, smoke rising from the chimney on a timer he'd set. It looked like home. Not his childhood home, not the house he'd shared with Claire, but something new, something he was learning to build for himself. Martin found the sealed envelope 3 days after mailing his letters. He'd been organizing the filing cabinet in the library, creating his own system for Elliot's documents. When he noticed it again, the envelope marked, "Open when you understand." He'd seen it before and left it alone, sensing its weight, knowing it contained something significant. But now, after weeks of reading journals and letters, after writing his own apologies and releasing his expectations, he felt ready. The envelope wasn't sealed with glue, but with old-fashioned wax, a burgundy seal pressed with Elliot's initials. Martin broke it carefully and withdrew several pages of heavy stationery. Asterisk, February 2023, asterisk, asterisk, Martin, asterisk, asterisk. If you're reading this, you've spent enough time in the house to understand what it's meant to teach. You've read my journals. You've found Margaret's recipes. You've heard the radio broadcasts, my voice speaking to you across the gap between life and death. Though really it's just technology and intention working together. Asterisk, asterisk. There's something you need to know. Something I tried to do and failed at. I'm telling you now, because you need to understand that some things can't be fixed, no matter how carefully we build, no matter how good our intentions. Asterisk, asterisk. 2 years ago, I reached out to your children, both of them. Asterisk. Martin's breath stopped. He read the sentence again, then forced himself to continue. Asterisk. I found them through social media, absurdly easy for someone who barely understood computers. I wrote to Andrew first, then Catherine. I explained who I was, that I'd been watching your family from a distance for years, that I could see the fractures and wanted to help. Asterisk, asterisk. I offered this house as neutral ground, a place where your family could come together, away from old battlefields and accumulated resentments. I made it clear this wasn't about inheritance. You were getting the house regardless. This was about relationship, about giving you all a space designed for healing. Asterisk, asterisk, I've enclosed copies of their responses. I'm sorry, Martin. I wish I had better news. Asterisk. Martin's hands shook as he turned to the next pages. Printouts of emails dated 2 years prior. The first was from Andrew. Asterisk, Mr. Cole. Asterisk, asterisk, I appreciate your concern, but our family situation is private. My relationship with my father is my own business, not yours. Whatever history you have with our family doesn't give you the right to interfere in matters you don't understand. Asterisk, asterisk. Respectfully, please don't contact me again. Asterisk, asterisk, Andrew Cole Times. The second was from Catherine, longer and gentler in tone, but equally final. Asterisk, Dear Uncle Elliot. Asterisk, asterisk, thank you for reaching out. I remember meeting you when I was little. You were kind to me. I appreciate that you're worried about Dad and want to help. Asterisk, asterisk, but I need you to understand something. My relationship with my father didn't break because of one fight or misunderstanding. It broke because of years of emotional absence. He was there, but not present. He provided, but didn't connect. He showed up, but didn't engage. Asterisk, asterisk. I've spent a lot of time in therapy working through this. I've done the grief work of accepting that my father can't give me what I needed. I've moved on. Not with anger, I don't hate him, but with acceptance that some relationships are what they are, and trying to force them to be different just causes more pain. Asterisk, asterisk. A house won't fix this. Geography won't fix this. Some things are just broken, and that's okay. We learn to live with it. Asterisk, asterisk. I hope you understand. Please give my regards. To Dad, if you're in touch with him. **** Catherine Times. Martin set down the papers. His vision had gone blurry. He wiped his eyes and read both messages again, then a third time. Elliot's letter continued on the final page. ***I'm telling you this because you need to know the truth. Your children didn't refuse to reconcile because they're cruel or ungrateful. They refused because they've accepted what is. Catherine especially has done the hard work of grieving a living parent, perhaps the most difficult grief there is. ***. I built this house, hoping it might bring family together. I was wrong. The house can't do that. What it can do is help you heal enough to accept what cannot be changed. ***, Martin. You were not the failure. You were failed by your father, by the pattern of emotional coldness that ran through our family like a fault line. You tried not to fail your children. You tried to be present, to provide, to be steady. But trying isn't always enough. Sometimes we repeat patterns we don't even recognize until it's too late. ***. The house will teach you to forgive yourself. That's the only forgiveness that matters now. Your children have moved on. They're building lives without you in them. That's not punishment. That's just reality. ***. You can't save everyone, even the people you love most. I learned this with Margaret. I couldn't save her from cancer, no matter how many hospitals we visited or treatments we tried. You're learning it with your children. The work now is to save yourself, to build something with what remains. ***. This house is yours. Do with it what you will. Live here, sell it, transform it. But whatever you choose, do it for yourself, not for the family you hope to rebuild. That hope is what's been keeping you trapped. ***. I wish I could have told you this in person. I wish I could have known you better. But perhaps the house will know you better than I ever could. ***. You're going to be all right, Martin. Not right away, but eventually. Elliot. Times. Martin sat in the leather chair, the letter pages scattered across his lap, and felt something fundamental shift inside him. Not break shift, like a bone that had healed wrong and needed to be rebroken to set properly. He'd been holding on to hope like a lifeline. Hope that if he just understood enough, apologized enough, changed enough, his children would come back. That Catherine would invite him to her wedding, that Andrew would soften, that the family could somehow be repaired. But they'd already decided, 2 years ago, before Elliot died, before Martin even knew about this house, they'd been offered a path to reconciliation and declined it. Politely, clearly, finally. The hope he'd been clutching wasn't a lifeline. It was an anchor, holding him in place, preventing him from moving forward. Martin stood and walked to the window. Outside, early March sunlight filtered through the pine branches. Snow remained in shadowed places, but bare ground showed in patches. The transition season, not quite winter, not yet spring. He'd thought coming to this house was about finding his way back to his family. But Elliot had known better. The house wasn't about bringing people together. It was about helping someone learn to stand alone, to accept what couldn't be changed, to forgive himself for not being what others needed. That night, Martin didn't sleep. He lay in the dark, feeling the house around him, its careful proportions, its engineered resonances, its intentional design. Elliot had built all of this, knowing it might not matter. Knowing Margaret was still dead, knowing family wounds might not heal, knowing that architecture couldn't solve every problem, but he'd built it anyway. Not because it would fix everything, but because the act of building itself mattered. Because creating something intentional and beautiful was its own form of healing, whether anyone else ever appreciated it or not. Around 3 a.m, Martin rose and went to the library. He pulled out the blank journal Elliot had left and began writing. Not to his children this time. Not to anyone but himself. Asterisk, I came here thinking I could fix what was broken. I was wrong. Some things stay broken. Some relationships end even though we don't want them to. Some children grow up and walk away, and we don't get to call them back. Asterisk. Asterisk. The question isn't how to fix it, the question is how to live with it. How to build something meaningful with what remains. How to forgive myself for being human, for making mistakes, for not knowing what I didn't know until it was too late to matter. Asterisk, asterisk. Elliot built this house for Margaret, but she was already gone. He built it anyway. Maybe that's the lesson. You build anyway. You create anyway. You move forward anyway, not because it changes the past, but because it's the only direction left to go. Asterisk. The backwards clock ticks steadily in the corner, each second a reminder of what was and couldn't be reclaimed. Martin wrote until dawn broke over the basalt cliffs, light flooding the octagonal room, illuminating his words on the page. When he finally set down his pen, he felt emptied out. Hollow but clean, like a house cleared of furniture, ready to be filled with something new. The storm hit on the third week of March, unexpected and fierce. The forecast had mentioned possible snow, but Martin had assumed they meant flurries, the last gasp of winter before spring took hold. Instead, he woke to 18 inches already on the ground, and more falling so thick he couldn't see the tree line 50 yards away. The power stayed on solar panels and battery backup, another of Elliot's careful preparations, but the road became impassable within hours. Martin checked his supplies and found he had enough for several weeks if necessary. Food, firewood, water from the well that ran on its own generator. Elliot had designed the house to be completely self-sufficient, which meant Martin was trapped here with himself and nothing to distract him from the truths he'd been circling for days. He tried reading, tried cooking, tried splitting wood in the garage, but even that familiar meditation couldn't settle his mind. The storm pressed against the windows like something alive, demanding attention. The world outside had contracted to just this house, this cliff, this small space carved out of wilderness. On the second day, Martin stopped fighting it. He retrieved the blank journal and began writing, not carefully, not with any thought to coherence, but as a way of emptying his mind onto the page. He wrote about his marriage, not the divorce, which he'd already examined, but the earlier years. Meeting Claire in college, both of them education majors, both idealistic about shaping young minds. She'd been warm where he was reserved, expressive where he was contained. He'd thought they balanced each other. Now he wondered if she'd just been doing the emotional work for both of them. Asterisk. Our first real fight was about Thanksgiving, 3 years in. She wanted to host both families. I said it was too much stress. What I meant was, I don't want people seeing inside our life. I don't want anyone close enough to notice the gaps, she cried. I didn't understand why hosting dinner mattered so much. Now I see it. She was trying to build family, to create connection, and I was putting up walls even then. Asterisk. He wrote about becoming a father, the terror of holding Andrew as a newborn, so small and fragile, the sense of responsibility that felt crushing rather than joyful, the distance he'd maintained even then, as if afraid that loving too much would somehow damage both of them. Asterisk. I held him, but not too close. Fed him, but let Claire do the rocking, the soothing, the real comfort. I told myself I was being practical, that mothers had instincts fathers didn't, but really I was protecting myself. From what? From the same thing my father protected himself from, the risk of being needed, of being insufficient, of failing. Asterisk. The words came faster, rougher. He wrote about Catherine's birth 3 years later, about how he'd hoped a daughter might break through his reserve somehow, about how she'd looked at him with such trust and how terrified he'd been of disappointing her. So he'd stayed distant, friendly but not intimate, present but not engaged. Asterisk. Catherine asked me once why I never played with them the way other dads did. She was maybe 6. I told her I wasn't good at playing, that I was better at other things like helping with homework. She accepted that. Children accept what their parents give them. They don't know they're allowed to ask for more. I taught both my children that love is something quiet and contained, that you show it through provision and presence, not through touch or words or actual connection. I taught them to be like me. And then I wondered why they grew distant. Asterisk. The storm continued through day 3. Martin had stopped tracking time precisely. He ate when hungry, slept when exhausted, wrote when the pressure in his chest demanded release. He wrote about his father, a man who died when Martin was 25, old enough to be an adult, but still young enough to need a father. They'd never had the conversation Martin had always thought they'd eventually have, the one where his father explained why he'd been so cold, so distant, or maybe apologized, or maybe just acknowledged what had been missing. Asterisk. Dad died of a heart attack at his desk. Quick, they said. Like that was a comfort. He was there one day and gone the next, and all the things I'd wanted to ask or say or hear just evaporated. I realized then that waiting for the right moment is just another form of cowardice. There's no right moment. There's just now, and now, and now, and then no more nows at all. Asterisk, asterisk. I repeated his pattern with my own children. Didn't mean to, meant to be different. But intention without awareness doesn't change anything. You need both. Asterisk. On the 4th day, the storm began to ease. The snowfall thinned to occasional flurries, and patches of blue appeared in the grey sky. Martin emerged from his writing fugue, feeling scraped raw but somehow cleaner. He'd written nearly 100 pages, filling the blank journal Elliot had left. He read back through what he'd written and saw the pattern clearly now. The inheritance of emotional distance, passed down through generations like genetic code. His grandfather, his father, himself, each one trying to be present while remaining protected. Each one creating children who felt seen but not known. But he'd also written something else, buried in the later pages, recognition that the pattern could end with him. That even if his children never forgave him, even if they never wanted relationship with him again, he could still break the cycle in himself. Could still learn, this late, what it meant to be emotionally honest, vulnerable, present not just physically but genuinely. He found the deed to the property in Elliot's filing cabinet, along with the letter of intent to the estate lawyer. The documents were clear. Martin had complete control. He could sell, stay, or transform the property however he wished. No restrictions, no conditions. Asterisk. Give Martin choices. Asterisk. Elliot had written to the lawyer. Asterisk. He's had too few in his life. This is about agency, not just inheritance. Asterisk. Martin sat at the kitchen table with the documents spread before him and let himself imagine possibilities. He could sell, give Andrew the money he wanted, though he knew now it wouldn't heal anything between them. He could stay, live here permanently, becoming the hermit Andrew had accused him of being. Or he could do something else entirely. The idea came slowly, built from pieces he'd been gathering without realizing it. Elliot had designed this house to heal psychological wounds, had researched acoustic properties and emotional geometry and how spaces could influence human experience. What if that wasn't meant just for Martin? What if it could help others? He spent the afternoon researching on his laptop, the internet sluggish but functional. Retreat centers, healing spaces, places where people navigating grief or loss or family estrangement could come for respite. The infrastructure was already here: solar power, geothermal heating, well water, 12 acres of land. The house was designed for exactly this purpose. By evening, Martin had contacted a non-profit that ran similar retreats across Montana. Their director, a woman named Patricia Grimm, responded within hours. They'd been looking for a new location. This could work. Martin wrote an email to Andrew, his hands steady on the keyboard. Asterisk. I'm not selling the house. I'm transforming it into... A retreat center for people dealing with grief and family estrangement. The property will remain in my name, but it will serve others. This honors Uncle Elliot's vision and gives the house a purpose beyond monetary value. I'm not asking your permission, I'm informing you of my decision. You're free to be angry about this. You're free to cut contact. You're also free to come visit someday if you change your mind. But I'm done trying to earn your approval. Asterisk. He sent it before he could second-guess himself. That night, the radio remained silent. No broadcasts, no static, just an old piece of technology sitting cold on its shelf. Martin realized he didn't need it anymore. Whatever Elliot had meant to teach him, he'd learned. The house had done its work. He stood at the window, looking out at snow-covered pines under a clearing sky, and felt something settle inside him. Not peace, exactly. Not yet. But something close to it. Acceptance, maybe. The understanding that he'd done what he could, apologized as honestly as possible, and released the outcomes he couldn't control. Tomorrow he'd begin the practical work of transformation, contacting contractors, planning renovations, working with Patricia's non-profit to create something that would outlast him. Tonight, he simply stood in the house his uncle had built and let himself feel the full weight of what had been lost and what might still be built from what remained. 2 weeks after the storm cleared, Martin received an email from Catherine. He'd been expecting silence. Andrew had responded to Martin's email about the retreat center with a single line times, "Do whatever you want," times which felt like a door closing. Martin had accepted it. He'd been working with Patricia's non-profit on preliminary plans, measuring rooms, sketching layouts for dormitory-style accommodations in the space where Elliot's workshop had been. The work felt good, purposeful. He was building something that would help people he'd never meet, solving problems he wouldn't be around to see resolved. There was freedom in that. Then Catherine's email arrived. The subject line read, "Asterisk, thank you for writing." Asterisk. Martin stared at it for a full minute before opening. Asterisk, Dad. Asterisk, asterisk. I got your letter a few days ago. I've read it several times. I wasn't going to respond, but I keep thinking about what you wrote, so here I am. Asterisk, asterisk, I appreciate your apology. I do. It means something that you can see what happened without making excuses. A lot of people never get there. Asterisk, asterisk, I want to be honest with you. I'm not ready to have you back in my life in any big way. The hurt is old, but it's still there. I've built a life that works without you in it, and I'm not willing to disrupt that stability. That probably sounds harsh. It's not meant to be, it's just the truth. Asterisk, asterisk, but I've been thinking about my wedding. Greg and I are getting married in August, in Portland. Small ceremony. Just close friends and family. I wasn't going to invite you, Mom said I. Should, but I didn't want to deal with the awkwardness or the questions or the emotional weight of having you there. Asterisk, asterisk. Then I got your letter. The part where you said you're proud of me, that you hope Greg is present with me in ways you never learned to be. That got to me. It felt honest. Like you were actually seeing me as a person with my own life, not just as your daughter who's disappointed in you. Asterisk. Asterisk. So, I'm considering inviting you, not to walk me down the aisle or give a speech or any of the traditional father of the bride things, but to be there. In the back, maybe. As a guest, not as part of the wedding party. Would that be okay with you? Asterisk, asterisk. I need you to understand that this doesn't mean everything is fixed between us. It doesn't mean I forgive everything, or that we're going to have weekly phone calls, or that you'll be a big part of my life going forward. It just means I'm willing to have you witness this one important day. That's all I can offer right now. Asterisk, asterisk. Let me know what you think. And Dad, I'm glad the house is helping you. Keep doing the work. Asterisk, asterisk, Catherine Times. Martin read the email 3 times. Then he stood and walked outside, needing air, needing space to feel what he was feeling without walls around him. The afternoon was cool but clear. Snow lingered in shaded patches, but the ground showed through in most places: brown grass, mud, the first tiny hints of green where early plants were beginning to push through. Spring was coming properly now. Catherine was considering inviting him to her wedding, not as her father, not in any traditional role, but as a guest, a witness, someone permitted to see but not participate in the center of her life. It hurt. He let himself feel that. It hurt that she felt the need to set such clear boundaries, to specify exactly how limited his role would be. It hurt that she was right to do so. But it was also grace. Unexpected, unearned grace. She didn't have to invite him at all. She didn't have to respond to his letter or acknowledge his apology or give him any space in her life whatsoever. She'd done the hard work of accepting his absence, of grieving him while he was still alive. She'd moved on. And yet, she was opening the door, just a crack, not because she needed him, but because she'd decided to offer him this small gift, the chance to witness her joy, even from a distance. Martin walked to the viewing platform where Elliot had carved his and Margaret's initials decades ago. The valley spread below, vast and indifferent to human concerns. Rivers would keep flowing, mountains would keep standing, seasons would keep turning, whether Martin attended his daughter's wedding or not. But he wanted to be there, wanted it with an intensity that surprised him. He returned to the house and wrote his response carefully. Catherine, ****. Thank you for considering this. Yes, I would very much like to be there. I understand the boundaries you're setting, and I respect them completely. I'm not asking for more than you're offering. Being able to witness your wedding, even from the back, even as just another guest, would mean more to me than I can properly express. ****, I'm proud of you for knowing what you need and being clear about it. That's strength I didn't have at your age, still learning it now, honestly. ****. Whatever happens from here, thank you for this. ****. Dad times. He sent it before doubt could creep in, before he could start worrying that he'd said too much or not enough. Then he sat at the kitchen table and cried messy, ungraceful tears that came from somewhere deep and long-sealed. Not tears of joy exactly, not relief either, something more complicated. Grief for what had been lost, gratitude for what was being offered, and the painful recognition that this small grace didn't erase the years of absence that had come before. That evening, Martin cooked Margaret's beef stew, the one that required 3 hours of low simmering. He followed her recipe exactly, letting the ingredients transform slowly, patiently. While it cooked, he worked on measurements for the retreat center renovation. Patricia had sent preliminary budgets and timelines. The work would take most of the summer, but they could potentially have their first guests by fall. His phone buzzed around 7. A text from Catherine, August 14th, Portland Botanical Gardens. I'll send you the details. 3 sentences. But they felt like a bridge being built, one careful plank at a time. Martin texted back, I'll be there. Thank you. He ate his stew slowly, savoring it, letting Margaret's recipe do what she'd intended, provide comfort and grounding on a day that required both. The kitchen smelled like home in the way only slow-cooked food can create. He understood now why she'd left these recipes, why she'd annotated them with care instructions. Cooking was connection. It was care made tangible. After dinner, he went to the library and opened the backwards-running clock's case. Inside, tucked behind the mechanism, he found a small envelope he'd never noticed. It contained a photograph Elliot and Margaret on their wedding day, both of them young and radiant, looking at each other like nothing else in the world existed. On the back, in Elliot's handwriting, ***, the 15th of June, 1960. The best day. Everything after was building toward keeping this feeling alive. ***, Martin studied the photo for a long time. Two people who'd had less than a decade together before cancer took one of them. Elliot had spent the next 55 years building monuments to that love, this house, the backwards clock, the recipe box, all of it an attempt to hold on to what couldn't be held. It was beautiful and heartbreaking in equal measure. Martin placed the photo back in the envelope and returned it to its hiding place. Some things were meant to be discovered, acknowledged, and then left where they belonged, reminders of what mattered, not objects to possess. That night, lying in bed, Martin thought about August. 4 months away, he'd go to Portland, stand in the back of the botanical gardens, and watch his daughter marry someone who hopefully knew how to be present in ways Martin never had. He'd smile if she looked his way. He'd leave quietly when it was over. He'd take what was offered without demanding more, and it would be enough. Not because it satisfied every longing, but because it was real. Because Catherine had chosen to give it, and that choice mattered more than any amount of presence he could have demanded or expected. Outside, wind moved through the pines. The house settled around him, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, Martin fell asleep feeling something like peace. Spring moved into early summer with unexpected speed. Martin worked on the property daily, clearing brush, repairing fences, preparing the workshop space for conversion to guest quarters. Patricia's non-profit sent architects and contractors who measured and planned and nodded approvingly at Elliot's infrastructure. Whoever built this knew what they were doing, the lead contractor said, examining the solar array. This system could run 3 houses this size, and the geothermal setup is museum quality. Your uncle was ahead of his time, Martin smiled. He had strong opinions about self-sufficiency. The renovation plans took shape. The workshop would become dormitory-style rooms for up to 8 guests. The main house would remain largely unchanged, its carefully designed spaces serving their intended purpose. A small cottage would be built near the tree line for Martin to live in, giving retreat guests full access to the main house. Martin reviewed the deed again one evening, confirming what he already knew. He had complete freedom to do this. Elliot had structured the inheritance without restrictions, trusting Martin to make whatever choice felt right. He thought about Andrew, who'd gone completely silent after that final email. Part of Martin wanted to reach out, to explain the vision more fully, to help his son understand. But he recognized that impulse for what it was, the old pattern, the need for approval and validation. Andrew would think what he thought. Martin's job wasn't to convince him. In late June, Martin received the formal wedding invitation in the mail. Heavy cardstock, elegant calligraphy. His name was listed among the guests, no special designation. He placed it on the refrigerator with a magnet, looking at it several times a day as if it might disappear. July brought the start of construction, the property filled with trucks and workers and the sounds of building. Martin moved into a trailer on site while his cottage was being built. He didn't mind the temporary quarters. There was something satisfying about living simply while watching something larger take shape. Patricia visited in mid-July to check progress. She was in her early 60s, grey-haired and direct, with the kind of competence Martin recognized in career educators. "This is going to be remarkable," she said, walking the property with him. "The location alone is healing. Add in your uncle's architectural design, and we'll be able to help a lot of people." "That's the hope," Martin said. "What made you decide to do this?" Patricia asked. "Most people would sell or keep it private." Martin considered the question. "I inherited more than property. I inherited intention. My uncle built this house to heal people. Keeping it for myself felt like missing the point." Patricia nodded. "He'd be proud of you." "I hope so," Martin said. "I never really knew him, but I think I understand him now." The final week of July, Martin drove to Billings to buy appropriate clothes for the wedding. He hadn't owned a decent suit in years. The shopping trip felt surreal, trying on jackets and dress shirts, being measured for alterations, discussing tie colors with a salesperson half his age. "What's the occasion?" she asked, while pinning his sleeve. "My daughter's wedding. How wonderful. You must be so excited." Martin smiled carefully. "I am. It's complicated, but yes, excited." He didn't explain that he'd be sitting in the back, that his role was minimal, that this was grace rather than reconciliation. The young woman didn't need his history. She just needed to pin his sleeves correctly. The suit would be ready by August 10th, 4 days before the wedding. Plenty of time. Martin spent his last days before leaving for Portland, finishing small projects on the property. The cottage was nearly complete, a simple 2-bedroom structure with a small kitchen and a porch facing the valley. He'd furnished it simply: a bed, a desk, shelves for books. Everything he needed, nothing he didn't. The backwards clock from Eliot's library now hung on his cottage wall. He'd asked Patricia if he could keep it, and she'd agreed immediately. "Personal items are yours," she'd said. "The house and its design belong to the retreat, but your uncle's personal effects are your inheritance." So Martin had taken the clock, some journals, Margaret's recipe box, and the photograph of Eliot and Margaret on their wedding day. Everything else would stay with the house, serving its intended purpose. On August 12th, Martin locked the cottage and drove to Billings to catch a flight to Portland. He'd booked a modest hotel near the Botanical Gardens. The plan was simple: arrive the day before, attend the wedding, stay 1 night after, then return home. Home. He'd started thinking of the Montana property as home. Not the cottage specifically, but the land, the house, the entire 12 acres. It was where he belonged now, where he was building something that mattered. The flight was uneventful. Portland in August was warm and green, the city bustling with life. Martin's hotel room was small but clean. He hung his new suit carefully and stood at the window, looking out at a city he'd never visited, where his daughter had built a life he barely knew. Tomorrow he'd see Catherine. She'd know he was there, but they probably wouldn't speak much. Maybe a brief greeting, maybe not even that. He'd watch her marry Greg, this man she'd chosen, this person who hopefully knew how to be present and engaged and emotionally available. Martin felt nervous in a way he hadn't experienced in years. Not about the ceremony itself, but about whether he could honor Catherine's boundaries. Whether he could sit in the back and be content with witnessing rather than participating. Whether he could let this be enough. He spent the evening walking the city, eating dinner at a small restaurant, rehearsing in his mind how to be present without imposing, how to offer support without demanding acknowledgement, how to witness someone's joy from a careful distance. That night, in the hotel room, he wrote in his journal, the one he'd continued from the blank pages Eliot had left him. Asterisk, tomorrow I get to see my daughter get married. Not as her father in any traditional sense, but as a guest she's chosen to allow. It's not what I would have wanted 3 years ago, or even 3 months ago, but it's what is, and I'm grateful for it. Catherine didn't have to offer this. She did anyway. That's grace. Real grace. The kind you receive with gratitude and don't try to expand into something larger. Tomorrow I practice accepting what's given without reaching for more. Asterisk. He closed the journal and turned off the light. Outside, the city hummed with evening traffic. Inside, Martin lay in the dark and thought about backwards clocks and forward motion, about what we inherit and what we choose to build, about the difference between being present and being there. Tomorrow would be difficult. Tomorrow would be beautiful. Tomorrow he'd watch his daughter begin a new chapter of her life, and he'd be grateful to witness it, even from the margins. That was enough. It had to be. The Portland Botanical Gardens were more beautiful than Martin had imagined. He arrived early, dressed in his new suit, and found a seat in the last row of white chairs arranged on the lawn. The ceremony site overlooked a pond, surrounded by Japanese maples and flowering rhododendrons. August sunlight filtered through the canopy, dappling everything in shifting patterns of light and shadow. Guests arrived gradually. Martin recognized Claire immediately. She looked well, happy even, holding hands with a man Martin assumed was her partner. She didn't see him in the back, or if she did, she gave no sign. That was fine. This day wasn't about their history. The ceremony was simple and lovely. Catherine appeared in a cream-colored dress, walking down the aisle alone, her choice, Martin had heard, to walk herself rather than be given away. She looked radiant, confident, entirely herself. Greg waited at the altar, beaming, and when Catherine reached him, they held both hands and just looked at each other for a long moment before the officiant began speaking. Martin watched from his seat in the back, tears streaming down his face that he didn't bother to hide. No one was looking at him anyway. All eyes were on Catherine and Greg, as they should be. The vows were personal, clearly written by the couple themselves. Catherine promised to be present, to listen, to choose Greg every day, even when it was difficult. Greg promised the same, with humor and tenderness that made the small gathering laugh and sigh. When the officiant pronounced them married, everyone stood and applauded. Catherine and Greg kissed, then walked back down the aisle together, both of them glowing. As they passed Martin's row, Catherine's eyes found his for just a moment. She smiled, small, genuine, acknowledging. Then she was past, greeting other guests, pulled into hugs and congratulations. Martin slipped away during the reception. He'd told himself he'd stay for one drink, but watching Catherine move through the crowd, so clearly surrounded by love and community, he realized his presence wasn't needed. She had what she needed. He'd witnessed what she'd invited him to witness. Anything more would be imposing. He returned to his hotel, changed out of his suit, and sat by the window as evening fell. His phone buzzed a text from Catherine. Asterisk. Thank you for coming. It meant something. Asterisk. Martin typed back. Asterisk. Congratulations. You were beautiful. Be happy. Asterisk. 3 sentences. Perfect and complete. 6 months later, Martin stood on the porch of his cottage and watched the first guests arrive at the retreat center. 2 women in their 50s, a man about Martin's age, a younger couple looking tentative. Patricia greeted them, showed them to their rooms in the converted workshop, explained the schedule and the property boundaries. The retreat would last 5 days. Guided sessions about grief and family estrangement, but also unstructured time. Time to walk the property, sit on the viewing platform, cook in the kitchen, read in the library. Time to let the house work on them the way it had worked on Martin. He'd decided to stay on as property manager and occasional counselor. His teaching background translated well to facilitating small group discussions, and he knew the house intimately, now knew which rooms fostered contemplation, which encouraged hope, how the light changed throughout the day, and what those changes could offer someone paying attention. The retreat center had been operational since October. They'd hosted 4 groups already, with more scheduled through the spring. The responses had been remarkable. People arrived broken and left not fixed, exactly, but different, softer, more willing to sit with difficult truths. The house did what Elliot had designed it to do. Martin had kept the backwards clock in his cottage, but he'd placed a small plaque in the main house library explaining Elliot's philosophy. Asterisk. Some inheritances aren't property, they're perspective. This house was built to help people heal. May it serve that purpose for whoever needs it. Asterisk. Andrew had never responded to news about the retreat center. Catherine sent occasional texts, brief updates about married life, pictures of her new apartment, nothing deep but maintaining connection. Martin didn't push for more. He responded warmly to what she offered and asked nothing beyond it. In December, she'd sent a Christmas card with a photo of her and Greg. On the back, asterisk, thinking of you. Hope you're well. Asterisk. Martin had put it on his refrigerator next to her wedding invitation. Now, in late February, with new guests settling into the house, Martin walked up to the viewing platform. The valley below showed early signs of spring snow melting, creeks running high, the faint haze of green beginning to show on southern slopes. He thought about Elliot, who'd stood here with Margaret decades ago and carved their initials. who'd lost her and spent 55 years building monuments to what they'd shared, who'd finally built this house not to bring back what was lost, but to help others survive their own losses. Martin understood now what the house had been teaching him all along. You couldn't reclaim the past. You couldn't force reconciliation. You couldn't make people love you or forgive you or want you in their lives. All you could do was accept what was, forgive yourself for being imperfect, and build something meaningful with whatever remained. The house had saved him, not by reuniting his family or erasing his mistakes, but by teaching him how to live with what couldn't be changed, how to transform grief into purpose, how to be alone without being lonely. He'd arrived here at 59, abandoned and purposeless. Now, at 60, he was building something that would outlast him, helping people he'd never meet, creating space for healing, even though his own healing was incomplete and always would be. That was enough, more than enough. A crow called from a nearby pine. Wind moved through the trees with that sound like distant water. The sun climbed higher, warming the air, promising spring. Martin stood on the platform his uncle had built, looking out at the valley, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not happiness exactly, not peace, which was probably too much to ask, but something close to contentment, the sense that he was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. Below, smoke rose from the house's chimney. Guests would be gathering in the main room, beginning their own journeys toward whatever healing they could find. The house would hold them the way it had held Martin, would teach them what it had taught him. Some inheritances weren't property, they were perspective, and perspective, Martin had learned, could change everything.